When I first started preaching, there was actually another young man that was in a preaching program, and the preacher there said to me one night, instead of me coming over here and staying up till 1 o'clock with you, why don't you show up tomorrow morning and just sit in on the classes? So I just began sitting in on the classes of the young man that was actually in the preaching program, and about 3 weeks later, Sunday night he was supposed to preach. He called me up and he said, I'm not ready to preach tonight. Can you do a lesson? And I said, sure. And I jumped up and I taught a lesson on baptism because that's what we had been studying that week in our preacher training class. And about 3 weeks later, he called me up. He was supposed to preach again. He said, I'm not ready. Can you preach again? I said, sure. So I got up and I preached a very simple lesson on the church because that's what we've been studying that week. Long story short, I've gotten into a habit that when I've been studying something, I'm going to unload on you. That's just the way that I've learned rather than trying to have a special project over here plus all of my other studying. So what I've been studying is the parables. And it's absolutely amazing to me. I found a absolute wonderful preacher book on parables. I'm not going to recommend it to any of you because he walks through all of the various sundry 40 different interpretations that people have made on each one of the parables, and he wrestles with why they're wrong or what good points they have. Anyway, one of the parables that I got reading over again is the parable of the unjust steward. And that's found in Luke chapter 16. And as I was studying this particular parable and this particular book that I've been reading on this, he began explaining all of the different ways that people have tried to understand this particular parable. Now, immediately that hit me on a wrong side of my studies, my thinking on parables, because the parables, as I said in the last couple of weeks, they were stories that Jesus told to an audience. And the audience was supposed to listen to this parable and go, oh, and come up with a conclusion and draw a perspective from that. And Jesus began many of the parables. What do you think? And by the time he got to the end, you were supposed to have thought it through, decided you weren't doing things right, and decided I need to change my way of life and begin doing that. And to listen to the way some of these people have interpreted the parables, you would never come up with that after sitting and studying the parable for 40 years and looking up every Greek word and doing all the word studies. And I finally decided the reason you wouldn't come up with that, that's not what the parable meant. And the parable has a particular meaning. Now, in the parable of the sower, one of the things that Jesus did there was he gave a very limited identification. He didn't identify everything in the parable, but he did identify some of the things. And what we've done, since that is probably the most famous parable in all of the Gospels, we've taken that as a clue that all parables then, you ought to be able to go through and identify what the various elements represent on the other side of the story. And I'm finding out, and I believe the unjust steward is a prime example. Sometimes the story is the story. That it wasn't intended to be torn apart and try to identify each part with a spiritual counterpart. Because when you get done trying to find the spiritual counterpart in this particular story, one writer, for example, said the unjust steward represents Jesus. Now you go figure out how to make that analogy and parallel, and his was just off of the wall. And as you begin looking at things, sometimes the story just is the story. So I'm just going to tell you what I'm thinking about on this particular parable. Starting in chapter 16. Now, he was saying to the disciples, there was a certain rich man. He had a steward, And this steward was reported to him as squandering his possessions. He called him in and he said, "What's this I hear about you? Give an account of your stewardship. You can no longer be a steward." The steward said to himself, "What shall I do? Since my master is taking the stewardship away from me, and I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg, I know what I'll do. So when I am removed from this stewardship, they will receive me into their homes." So he summoned each one of the master's debtors, and he began saying to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said, "Take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, "How much do you owe?" And he said, 100 measures of wheat. He said, "Take your bill and write down 80. And his master praised the unrighteous steward because he had acted shrewdly. To the sons of this age are more shrewd in relationship to their own kind than the sons of light. And I say unto you, make friends for yourselves by means of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. Now he who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful in also much. And he who is unrighteous in a very little thing, he's unrighteous also in much. If therefore you have been faithful in the use of unrighteous mammon, who will entrust true riches to you? And if you've not been faithful in the use of that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. And now, when the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, were listening to all these things, they were scoffing at him. And he said to them, "You are those who justify yourself in the sight of men, but God knows your hearts. For that which is highly esteemed among men is detestable in the sight of God." The law and the prophets, they were proclaimed until John. And since then, the gospel of the kingdom of God is preached, and everyone is forcing his way into it. But it's easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of the letter of the law to fail. Now, as you begin reading this, and you begin wrestling with it, and so we approach it beginning like we did the parable of the sower, and we ask the obvious question: who does the unrighteous steward represent in this parable? Who does the steward represent? Who the debtors represent? In my estimation, I've read about 60 different interpretations, and I find them all just totally lacking. That it'll sound right when you're reading that, and then you go read the parable and you begin and it just all begins to unravel and fall apart. So I decided, close up all the commentaries and just stick with the book. Just read the parable over again. And I finally came to the conclusion that what you're reading here, Jesus told a story. And the story is the story. And the story tells us, as Jesus makes application of what we ought to get out of the story. And if anybody knew what the story meant and how we ought to apply that, it's Jesus, for he told the story. In fact, he may have made the story up to emphasize the point that he wants to do. Now, begin looking at the larger context, and in the immediate context here, verses 1 through 8 is really, and just the first part of verse 8, is the story. And then right in the middle of verse 8, bad verse break, Jesus begins explaining. So he makes observations. Here's what you see in this story. And then down in verse 11 and 12, Jesus actually makes the application that he thinks people ought to get out of hearing this particular story. Now, as you keep reading, verse 13, he makes a warning. Why did he tell the story? And the answer is because people had a problem with money. They had a problem with things and worldliness. And so he gets down, and verse 13 is really the application of what's going on. But then as you go to verse 14, as I kept on reading, immediately the Pharisees entered the picture. But did y'all notice the Bible here does something it doesn't do very often? It took and identified the problem of the Pharisees. It described their character, their mental state, their outlook. Pharisees who were lovers of money. Why did Jesus tell this? Well, now you're beginning to see. Here's a group of people that they didn't know how to use money. They'd made wrong decision about what they were to do, how they were to live their life, what they were to center their life on. And then you just keep right on reading and you get to another one of the most famous parables in the Bible, and that's the story of the rich man and Lazarus. And again, the story of the rich man and Lazarus, it wasn't really told to teach us about the afterlife. The primary point, it does teach us, by the way, but the primary point was to teach about money. And so I always remember in Bible class, the first time I asked after teaching this, I said, who would you rather be, the rich man or Lazarus? And I think it was Brother Keith Everell, but I'm going to give him the credit even if it wasn't. He said, well, I want to be the rich man in this life and Lazarus when I die. And you know, I think that's the truth. I think underneath, that's the way the Pharisees would be, and that's the way many of us are. But you notice that's right here in the context that we're spending this whole time in chapter 16 talking about the proper concept about our wealth and about our things and about our possessions on that. And so as you begin trying to figure out what's this all about, I decided I'm going to get out all of the Bibles that I have, and particularly the ones that have little titles above the paragraphs. Now, y'all know those titles were not written by Luke or Mark or Matthew. They were written by the people that put the Bible together. But it was interesting. They followed what I've learned is the normal interpretation of this passage. And so as you begin looking these up, this is the parable of the dishonest manager. English Standard Version, the Holman Christian Standard Version, the New Revised Standard Version, and many others. That was the most often used designation. So I would begin looking at that and I'm going, what do I think about this steward that was talked about? And then another one. He is the unrighteous steward, New American Standard Bible. The unjust steward, the Amplified Bible. Now, it was amazing to me how many interpreters tried to figure out how to make that steward a good guy. And one went so far as to say he actually represents Jesus. Wow. But the point is, I don't think so. And so you take all of these titles, and I know they're not inspired, but as you begin, he was unjust. And as you begin going through there, the Phillips Bible, which I don't often quote that, but he put a clever rogue and the right use of money. And I think Phillips got it right in the sense that he understood what the parable was about. And it was not really about the steward, it was about how he used money, his wisdom and what was going on. So the title of the parable makes me still think, whatever you're going to think about this guy, he was unjust. He was unrighteous. He didn't do that which was right. So the unrighteous steward, when he is called before the owner and accused, I've heard that you are squandering my money, He makes no appeal. He doesn't justify himself. He doesn't try to explain. He just immediately says, I'm in trouble. I need to make provisions. How am I going to live on that? Second of all, he recognized the problems in his life. He was being terminated. He was not going to have a job. And I'm going to tell you, if you're in money and you get fired for embezzlement, it's hard to get another job in money. That follows you around very quickly. So here's a man, and then he's going to be let loose because he has squandered stewardship. And then he says, and I'm too weak to dig, and I'm too proud and arrogant to beg. I think if he got hungry enough, he'd probably get over that. But he didn't want to go down that rate. So the interesting thing was, he was wrong. And so he begins contemplating, what am I going to do? Where can I go with this? How am I going to live a month from now? How am I going to live next year? And so he provides then for his future. Now, the reason that everybody calls him the unjust steward is because what he did wasn't right. It wasn't right. Now, people have tried to say, well, you see, the Jews weren't supposed to charge interest anyway, and so what he did was he tacked on interest, and then when he got caught at tacking on the interest, he called them in, and he simply undid the interest that he tacked on that the manager didn't know. And my first question to you is, where did you read that in the text? Where is it implied in the text that this is what the guy did? And what you're going to find as you study the writings of this, people will read into the text their answer. They don't get it out of the text because it's not in the text. What's in the text is he was an unjust steward that was squandering his master's money. And now, when he got caught, he makes provision for what's going to happen. And so, verse 8, he's commended. And I'm just going to tell you, be careful with that. He was. But the question that you ask is, commended for what? And the answer was, he was commended for making a wise decision about his future. Had nothing to do with his stewardship with the owner and repaying the money. No, the only thing that he was commended about was that what he had done had set him up so that when he is fired from this job, he will have a future. It will be taken care of. And when Jesus did that, Jesus then made the first inkling of the comparison here. And he said, for the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. Now you take one look at the Pharisees. They consider themselves to be children of light. They were the teachers, they were the leaders among the people, but they were lovers of money. They were misusing money. The rich man and Lazarus. The rich man was held in esteem. You know, it's always interesting to me when they threw the memorial for the rich man. How many people do you think showed up for that? Probably the whole town. And Lazarus? They took him out and buried him. Nobody would have showed up. And the difference is, the moment that they were dead, and we see what happens on the other side, Abraham greets Lazarus. And the rich man, nobody cares. And he's in torment. Now, why did Jesus tell that story? And again, it wasn't because of the afterlife per se. That was necessary to tell the story. But the real point is, you can have all the money that you want in this life, but if you're without God and you die, you're in serious, serious trouble. You can't undo that. And so this is the context that Jesus is telling this story. And what he is trying to get us to realize is, we need to provide for the future. In all of our getting, and all of our doing, and all of our studying, and all of our work, and all of our relationships, what we need to take into account is someday there will be an accounting for this. We are stewards of everything we have. Paul asked in 1 Corinthians, what do you have that was not given to you? I got 3 banjos, I earned the money, and I bought them. Who gave you the power to earn money? Who gave you the health? Who gave you the education to do the job that you did to make the money? And you see, when you begin getting down to the bottom line there, I live and move and have my very being because God allows it to take place. So as we begin looking at this, Jesus is commending him, not because he cheated the boss out of the money, not because he was making interest with nobody else knew about. He made one good decision. He knew he was going to be in trouble, and he made the provision so that when that day came, he was provided for. Are we ready for that day? How do we begin applying this? Verse 9. Jesus said, and I say unto you, make friends with the wealth of unrighteousness. Why? For when it fails, do y'all realize it will fail? Do you realize it may be the day you die that it fails, but it will fail? It failed the rich man. He died and left everything here. And that's exactly what everybody is going to do. And so what we need to do is we need to make friends by the use of the things that we have, not for this life and not for our new house or a bigger car. We are to make friends. We are to understand how to use money in order that when it fails, we can be ushered into eternal abodes. Now I want you to just stop and think. What does money in this life have to do with eternity? What does being rich in money have to do with being right with God and expecting to go to heaven? And I hope you answered nothing positive, but a lot on the negative side. And so in the even larger context of this, I would challenge you, sit down and read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and make a note of every time Jesus talks about money or possessions, and I will challenge you to find one good statement about that, except this one. And this is an odd one. What am I supposed to do with all my money? What am I supposed to do with my job? What am I supposed to do with my life that God has given? And the answer is, you need to be prepared for the future. Make friends with the money and use it the way that it's supposed to be used in order that you will make righteous eternity your home. Verse 10, Jesus talks about this principle from a standpoint of faithfulness. If you've been faithful in little things, you'll probably be faithful in big things. But if you've not been faithful, then you're probably not going to be faithful in big things anyway. Are you faithful in your use of money? Are you faithful in your possessions and your worldliness and all that goes on in this life? And the answer is, if you're using it to make sure that you're going to be right with God, you are. Otherwise, you need to go back and read this parable all over again. Now, the faithful steward, if he's not, verse 11, not faithful in unrighteous wealth, then you're not really faithful to God. If you don't use your possessions to the glory and the honor of God, then what you've done is you've used them for selfish purposes, and you're not right with God. So Jesus makes an application here, and it's about our faithfulness to how we use mammon and riches and the things of this world. Again, in verse 12, this is the very basics of stewardship. Everything we have, including our health, including our jobs, our family, our friends, all that we have, we are to be using that to the very glory and the honor of God, providing for our eternal relationship with God. And so in verse 13, he simply then cuts right to the chase and gives you the dictum. Choose whom you're going to serve. Now you realize Jesus used this phrase several times. He used it in the Sermon on the Mount when he was talking about worldly things. And he said, you cannot serve God and mammon. Now, as I was reading that, I thought, that sounds like a lot of other verses. Not only was it repeated twice, but in the story when the rich young ruler met Jesus, and Jesus got done and he went away sorrowful, Jesus said, with great difficulty will the rich enter into heaven. And I'm convinced we don't believe that, because everybody seems to always want to be a little richer. We don't want to be Getty or any, but just a little more comfortable, a little. But of course, the moment you get there, you want just a little more, because it never satisfies. The psalmist long, long ago said, if riches increase, don't set your heart upon them, because they fly away. You can't hold on to them. Again, the psalmist said, do not be afraid when a man becomes rich, when the glory of his house increases. For when he dies, he'll carry nothing away. His glory will not go down after him. But you ought to be afraid of God, who you will give an account to on that. Again, Proverbs chapter 11, whoever trusts in his riches will fall, but the righteous will flourish like a green leaf. Now, the righteous here may or may not have money. I want to throw that into this, because Abraham was righteous, and he did have money. And Zacchaeus, the tax collector, Luke chapter 19, he was rich, but how he used the money. Job, as far as we can tell, was abundantly rich, but they were righteous. And they put righteousness first. And what made them righteous was not the money, but how they used and what they thought of the money. The money was neither here nor there. And I'm going to tell you, that's hard. It's hard to ever get your head wrapped around money that way. One of the reasons is it's deceitful. Now, Jesus began using some of those concepts in Matthew chapter 6. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal. For where your treasure is, that's where your heart is going to be. And it's after that he says you can't serve two things. And so the proper use of money is right here in the middle of this unjust stewardship and what we ought to do with that. He said, lay up yourself treasure in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroy and thieves do not break in nor steal. Or again, in Mark chapter 4, telling the parable of the sower, he said, the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches and the desire for other things, they enter into your life and they choke out the Word of God and they prove unfruitful. Now those were for the disciples that heard and quickly believed, but they had no root. And what takes place is the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches, it enters in and they squander their master's goods. They're like the unjust steward at that point. And what they need to do is to make sure that they have a place to dwell when they have to give an account. Turn with me to 1 Timothy chapter 6. When I've go and read this, I have often thought to myself, I wonder if Paul somehow or another read through some of Jesus' statements on money. Whether he did or whether he's inspired, it's all the same message. And what Paul tells you in this chapter is the same thing that Jesus has just said. For example, go down, if you will, to verse 6. And it says, godliness is actually a means of great gain when accompanied to contentment. For we have brought nothing into the world, we can take nothing out of the world. He got that out of Psalms. And if we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. But those who want to get rich, they fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and into destruction. For the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil. And some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith, and they have pierced themselves with many a pang. And now you begin seeing the unjust steward again. And here they were. They had the stewardship of their money and their riches, and they squandered it. They squandered the spiritual life. They squandered their relationship with God on that. And then what Paul then goes on, he says, but, verse 11, flee from these things, you man of God. Pursue after righteousness and godliness and faith and love and perseverance and gentleness. If your goal in life is to be rich and comfortable, you've missed the story of the gospel. You've missed your relationship with God. That what you do is you pursue after faith and righteousness, and then whatever gets added, you can enjoy. But that's not your goal. That's not your desire. And if we go through another depression sometime and you lose all of that, you won't be the one jumping out of the tall buildings. Because you recognize, easy come, easy go. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. The Lord blessed me with it and I was using it, but now I don't have it. I'm still going to worship God. You'll be like Job. You may lose your faith and your wealth and everything you have, but you're going to stand there and say, I refuse to not serve God. There's a double negative there. You got to think about it. I'm going to serve God. It doesn't matter. And that was the test that Satan put with him. So as we read this unjust steward, Paul begins to say, you have to pursue these things in your life and not the money. And down at verse 17, he says, instruct those who are rich in this present world to be not to be conceited or to fix their hope upon uncertainty of riches, but fix their hope upon God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Instruct them then to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous, and to be ready to share. What happens if you do that? Well, then you're storing up for yourselves a treasure of good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is life indeed. Chapter 6 of 1 Timothy is really the application of the parable of the unjust steward. And it's a negative application. Don't be like him. What did he do? Well, be like him in this one point, that you make provision for your soul. Whatever else you do. Brother Grover Stevens used to end almost every single sermon. If you miss heaven, you've missed all there is to life. No matter what else you may have done, if you miss heaven, you have missed life. You've missed eternal life, but I'm going to tell you, you missed life. You didn't understand what real godly life in this life is all about. So my take on the unjust steward was he was an unjust steward, but the moment that he found out, he made provisions for the future, and you need to go and do likewise. Are you ready? What if tonight's the last night? Are you ready? If you give an account of your stewardship of your life, have you been using it correctly? Are you ready to give an answer? Have you prepared that they will receive you into eternal beings? If you've messed up, it's okay. God offers forgiveness through Jesus. And through Him, you can become God's child. You can start over again. You can be a new creature. You can have a new beginning with a new hope. What you need to do is put the old life behind you. Turn away from that, repenting of your sins. Turn back to Jesus. Obey Him tonight. Be baptized for the remission of sins. And you can start all over. And this time, get it right. And make provision for eternity. If you're willing to do that, we invite you to come. As together we stand and sing.